I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob.
Yo.
Today we are interrupting our 10-part series.
Our regularly scheduled programming.
For something that's in the news.
Literature's in the news?
I know we don't normally get to do real reporting because, most Chinese literature is in the past by its nature.
But nothing really literary is ever hot off the presses.
Except today, this week, we have
the most expensive poem in the history of Chinese literature,
probably
Lee.
in the history of literature, really.
Can't imagine anything beating this.
So this poem cost the company Meituan $26 billion of its market capitalization in a single day, costing the founder Wang Xing
$2.5 billion of his personal wealth. Because he posted a poem, a classical poem from the Tang Dynasty that people took the wrong way. Like very much the wrong way. The poem he quoted, is by the poet Zhang Jie. And depending on how you translate the title, it could just be called The Book Burning Pit. And it is a reference to when the Emperor Qin Shi Huang had, depending on how you read it, all or most of the most well-known or important intellectual texts of that era burned. According to Wang Xing, this was not a reference to the Chinese Communist Party's current attempts to lock down the spread of information.
Nope, couldn't be, couldn't possibly be.
No way could it be that, no way.
In fact, I think he said that it was a reference to how his company was going to destroy his competitors.
I forget the specifics of that. I know it has something to do with, he said it had something to do with business. But in this era, with things as contentious as they are, citing a famous book-burning poem is a tricky proposition. You know what? Let's go ahead and just read the poem first, because we actually have we have the Chinese and of course our English translation, and we'll do that. The way maybe the listener can get some handle on it.
Yeah.
You mind if I just read the Chinese real quick? It's like
go for
12
it. Yeah.
characters. Okay, this is the Book Burning Pit. 竹波烟消地业虚，关河空锁祖龙居。坑灰未冷，山东乱，流向原来不读书。
Smoke melts the bamboo strips of books. The imperial work is undone. The forts and rivers vainly lock up the home of the ancestor dragon. The book-burning pits are not yet cold, and yet Shandong revolts. Liubang and Shangyu originally could not even read.
And mine reads similarly, but it reads this way. The smoke from bamboo scrolls proved meaningless the emperor's work. The Hangu Pass was locked, the Yellow River emptied to protect Qin Shi Huang's palace. Shandong was in disorder before the ashes had even cooled, and Qin was overthrown by those who could not even read. Now, historically, Lee, for any of the listeners who are not aware that Qin Shi Huang was the emperor who, quote-unquote, unified China, basically by telling everyone to unify or they're dead. Army is a very powerful unifying force.
Yeah, so just to go over the basic history that you're kind of gesturing towards, China existed as a bunch of imperial states, or not imperial really, just kind of kings. It was almost like medieval Europe. And we're talking about like 3rd century BCE, so long, long ago in a far, far away place. And then this guy, his name is King Zheng of Qin. He actually destroyed all of those different kingdoms, kind of Napoleon style, or probably more proper to say Napoleon did it very King Zheng style, since he was about 2 millennia before.
Way later, yeah.
But in 221 BCE, the guy assumed the title of the first emperor of Qin, that is Qin Shi Huang, and that marks the very beginning of the imperial era in Chinese history. It doesn't last too long, his dynasty. It's incredibly influential, but really, really short. One of the reasons that historians and scholars have said it was short is because it was so brutal. One of the brutal things that was done was that all of the books from the past that, didn't have the Qin people in a positive light were burned, and the Confucian scholars, the rule, were buried. Anyways, shortly after that, the dynasty collapsed shortly after Qin Shi Huang he died, and his son was put on the throne, but things didn't last too long. I think it was maybe like 2 or 3 years. And the claim that this poem is making is
that the emperor thought to himself, look, if I'm going to hold on to this, I got to make sure all the intellectuals and ministers and all those people fall in line. They're not going to fall in line if they have the choice of thousands of things to read and everybody disagrees. So I'm going to burn all that. So there's only one way to look at things. Cool. Except, according to the poet, the dynasty is eventually overthrown by a pair of people who couldn't read at all.
The historical kind of traditional perspective is that they're overthrown because they were so cruel and they didn't get the elites, the scholarly elites, on their side, because they were always doing this thing where they imposed their view, they imposed that sort of one-way reading of history. And to be honest, we don't actually know if this book burning and burying of Confucian scholars actually happened or how true it was. Like, something did happen, but the texts that we have are from the Han Dynasty, and the Han Dynasty's legitimacy is established based on how bad the Qin was. So the last line is Liu Bang and Shang Yu originally could not even read. Liu Bang and Shang Yu helped overthrow the Qin. Liu Bang is the one who finally founds the Han Dynasty. And so he has every intention of all of the history being written about the Qin as being kind of denigrating to the Qin.
But it's important to point out here that to some extent, whether or not historically we can prove it happened is, in this case, kind of beside the point, because
Absolutely.
This is one of those stories that everyone is familiar with. Referencing it is an immediate touchstone. It's like saying something like George Washington crossing the Delaware, or some version of that from our own history. The moment you mention it, everyone knows more or less what you're talking about, even if they're not 100% familiar with the historical context.
When you say our own history, remember, Rob, lots of the listeners, the manifold listeners of our podcast are from a variety of countries.
It's very true. All over the world. That's just actually true. I said that in kind of a snarky way, but it is true. For those who are not, you know what? Pick your own reference. Trying to find a similar reference off the top of my head is very tricky.
I think the Napoleon reference is pretty good. I mean, because Napoleon did try and impose a lot of rules on all of Europe, and so I think that's a good touchstone for most of our listeners.
Could be. I think could be. I was thinking of one story though that's so embedded in the culture that you can reference it in social media and everyone's going to know what you're talking about.
All of our listeners know Napoleon.
No,
all the smart people.
All our listeners are super smart, so clearly that's where we're going with this. What's interesting about this? There's a couple of things interesting about the citation of Zhang Jie's
First thing that's interesting,
poem.
and we just have to underline this: $26 billion.
Yes.
This poem cost a company $26 billion. Wow.
And it's an old, it wouldn't even matter if it's an
this
old
is
poem.
This is written in the time, I think, pre-Charlemagne, right? Like this is,
yes.
And it's not even, this is not a poem that before this week I had ever read. It's in the Tang Shi.
There's a lot of poetry in the Tang Dynasty. When we say we haven't read it, that's not a negative.
I mean, if we're talking about 1960s music, it's not Beatles, it's not Rolling Stones, it's more of like Monkees level.
Having said that,
there's a reference that everybody knows.
Man, I can't believe you're making Zhang Jie as the Monkees of anyway.
He's certainly not a Paul McCartney.
No. Of course, I don't like Paul McCartney, so we'll have to have
that's
discussion
a different you're wrong debate.
So overrated. But this poem is really interesting, and like the best Tang poems, it's very subtle in how it goes about accomplishing what it does. It doesn't come out and say, if you do this thing, it's actually going to blow up in your face. It just kind of leaves it out on the table for you to think about.
I wonder, though, for those readers who are deeply embedded in this history, I'm thinking specifically of contemporaneous Tang readers of Zhang Jie's poem. You said it's not explicit, but to me, I think that it would be incredibly explicit to them if they're reading it. Like it is kind of like slapping you in the face, bonking you on the head, kind of like, this is what will happen if you keep kind of cutting down on these freedoms and it's very problematic that I'm even using this kind of modern American word. But that is what it's talking about. Like there is a sense of liberty that has to be given, at least to the elites, to have these intellectual debates. And that's what the author of this poem is commenting on.
There's some interesting comparisons made between natural boundaries and intellectual boundaries. It references, at least in my reading, my interpretation, emptying the Yellow River or blocking a mountain pass, like making it impossible for anyone to storm into the kingdom physically, but it's connecting it with this burning intellectual materials. So you're trying to keep the gate closed, which is the same sort of thing as the intellectual material. Like the state relies on both.
These kind of ideas find a way to get through to, they're like a kind of natural force, like a river or air. It's like trying to block something that's
right.
That's
exactly.
nature.
You can block it, but things will always happen to squeak through. You can't stop it.
It's almost a very Taoist argument, like in trying to do something actively.
You're focusing on one perceived threat, and because you're focusing on that, a threat you didn't even see coming is the one that gets you.
Can I ask Rob, so I'm really interested in this last line. So I translated it as Liu Bang and Shang Yu originally could not even read. You translated it, and the Qin was overthrown by those who could not even read. What do you get out of that? Like, what is the fact that Liu Bang and Shang Yu, and just to make clear, the poem does definitely
I glossed
reference
it
those two.
for the
I think
sake of clarity, for, you know.
Right. And I think I don't know which one. Like, it's always this debate in translation, like clarity versus.
Who are you translating for? I figured if we
posted
posted these, it would be better to emphasize less the names and the thing. So yeah,
and we'll post both of these on the blog. So please check them out, and if you have any comments on them, let us know. But Rob, what do you think about this reference to Liu Bang and Shang Yu and the fact that they couldn't read? Like, how is that relevant? I mean, it almost seems like to me it's just this ironic turn that the poem ends on, even though you were trying to stop people from reading these Confucian works. The people who overthrew you couldn't even read. So, right, like is it saying that the thing that you were trying to prevent did not have any effect on the real problem that you were having, or did it cause it? Does the poem claim that the book burnings and the burying of Confucian scholars actually caused
that's a good question.
The downfall
I don't
of the
know
Qin?
that, like, because the specific then reference would be they burned these books, which is what brought down these attacks from these unlettered people. I don't know that I read it that way. The way I read it is that the book burning arose from an obsession with trying to control a group of people that was perceived to be the real threat. But by being obsessed with that, they missed a completely different problem.
So I actually disagree. I think it's weird. I think you're reading it in a very Taoist way, and normally I'm the Taoist on the podcast. I actually think that Zhang Jie is specifically hinting that the book burning directly causes the downfall of the Qin, and he's being ironic in claiming that Liu Bang and Shang Yu couldn't even read, and yet still that book burning over the topic of who gets to read what caused them to overthrow.
That sounds like a leap. Where are you getting that these two guys wanted to overthrow the Qin because they burned books and they couldn't read?
So I give you that it's a leap, but I think that it's so that thinking is so baked into the traditional historiography of the Qin dynasty. Everything that anybody in Tang Dynasty China discusses about the Qin makes the claim that the callous nature and the harsh rule that was epitomized by the book burning and the burying of scholars caused the downfall. And because that's baked into the historical interpretation, it's not in the poem, but it's so baked into the background of the poem that it...
I mean, you can absolutely make a link between overall brutality and these two storming in. I don't see the link between books in particular and these two guys storming in. Like, It was the books that did it. These guys couldn't read. They saw the books burning and went, you know what? That's a step too far. You took away the books. We can't read them, but we still need them. Let's go take over.
As you're interpreting this poem, Rob, you're focusing too much on what is in the poem and not enough on the kind of historical, intellectual context of the poem.
I'm close reading the poem. I mean, who would have thought
but you're close
such a
reading
thing?
the poem out of the environment in which it was created.
I forgot that you used to time travel back and forth to the Qing Dynasty to live among the people.
I traveled to the Tang Dynasty.
True. But also the Qin and then back and forth. You've been all over the place. But again, I still don't see where you're getting the books. It was the books that did it. Not the brutality. It was the books, specifically the books.
Brutality as epitomized by the books.
I still don't see why the books were the thing. Not the building of the Great Wall that cost millions upon millions of lives. It was the books. That was it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. And why two unlettered, specifically the poem emphasizes unlettered. They couldn't read. To me, that means you thought burning the books would do it, but in the end, it was people who couldn't read that took over.
I think this is one of those things that we're just going to have to agree to disagree on.
I don't want to get... You and I can go too much in the weeds with this because we're nerds. Let's get back to the fact that regardless of how you interpret this poem, it just cost a company a ton of money. And why? Why does this poem cost a company so much money?
So there is a long tradition in China and Chinese literature of using old historical events referenced in other literary works and kind of gesturing towards them and going, hey, I'm going to talk about this thing that's completely unrelated to anything that's happening right now. Wink, wink.
Scare quotes around it. It's totally not what's happening today. It's in the past.
This is what kind of launched the Cultural Revolution. The vice mayor of Beijing referenced a Ming Dynasty event that was discussed, I think, in a play, and I think he wrote a play on it, if I remember correctly. You know, how many millions of people died? Because, I mean, he first off was his future did not look good.
But, you know, and to bring it back to the specific thing in the present, Wang Xing references this poem. Whether he's talking about business or the state, he is doing the same thing, right? He's taking an old poem and he's using it to refer to something today. The reason this is his explanation is a little dodgy is because it's a real reach to see how this applies to business. I mean, in order for this to work, what he would have to be saying effectively is Meituan has been working hard to brutally throttle all possible competitors, but someone's going to get us in the end. That's the only way that would work.
I mean, is his interpretation, is his claim that he is the Qin emperor, that Meituan?
Or is he the unlettered doofus who takes over?
His interpretation just doesn't work. So I hate to say this, but if you're investing in Meituan right now,
be careful. But one of the interesting things about this is that usually when you have such an extreme reaction to what seems like criticism of government policy, you chalk that up to idiots, right? People who just don't, they looked at their Twitter feed and now they're ready to take to the streets and without thinking. But what's interesting here is there's kind of a collision between high and low brow, right? I mean, you've got people responding in what we would say is kind of unwise, angry fashion, but over an ancient poem. So you have to be both relatively well-read and also willing to take to the streets, or in this case, I don't know, take to the stock exchange, something over a tweet or a message, right? There's a combination of two things happening at the same time, which I find fascinating.
A good place to end here is to say that if you're thinking about investing in Meituan or anywhere else in China, one thing you definitely need to have as an investment, and this is a hot tip, Rob, is an anthology of Chinese literature.
Or possibly a subscription to a podcast that talks about Chinese literature. That would be a great
idea. Hang on, we don't do subscriptions, though.
Well, we do have Patreon, so you're willing to pay us.
If you're thinking about investing in the Chinese stock market, what you're saying, how I am interpreting what you're saying, Rob,
is
that they should invest in us through Patreon?
I mean, I'm saying it in that same subtle fashion that Zhang Jie.
We're not saying that we will earn you $26 billion.
But we may be able to save you $26 billion.
All right, Rob. I think that's a perfect point to end it on.
I agree.
I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.